He's been one of the most divisive, especially divisive younger figures in this, who is constantly sort of pushing this sort of hate speech or sort of aimed at certain groups. I always go back to hateful thoughts lead to hateful words, which then lead to hateful actions.
It is time that we all perceive gender on a spectrum.
Everybody who has been brave enough to be honest about how they feel, to live their lives as they are, as they feel they should be, as they identify.
You've done so much to advance the cause of equality and freedom, equal justice under law. It is not to be debated.
Equality and justice for all, period.
LGBT rights are under attack.
Grace and peace, everybody. We're back. You saw the thumbnail. You saw the title. You know what we're going to do. We're going to jump over here and check out what Martin the Decoder had to say about the hate that Tyler Robinson had toward Charlie Kirk that is greater than what we even imagined. So let's go ahead and jump in. Let's go. Let's go.
This Tyler Robinson, and why did he do what he did? A family member said that Robinson had described conservative activist Charlie Kirk as full of hate and spreading hate. Robinson was also reportedly in a relationship with his roommate, who was in the process of transitioning. It's important to recognize how oversimplifications and emotional appeals shape the world we live in, especially the messages young people absorb, from the classroom to social media and mainstream news. The word hate is a floating signifier, a term with no fixed or universally agreed upon definition. Words like this are easily monopolized by politicians, celebrities, and media figures who use them to advance their agendas.
Can we also add phobia, all phobic, to that as well?
Without ever clearly defining them. What feels inclusive to some may feel exclusive to others. What one person sees as hateful, another may view as morally right or even loving. That ambiguity is the point. It allows language to be stretched, manipulated, and emotionally charged, often without accountability. Floating signifiers like freedom, justice, progress, equality, patriotism, and even adjectives like divisive don't have consistent meanings. They're open to interpretation, yet they're used to draw ideological lines. Politicians, commentators, and activists attempt to monopolize these words, framing themselves as the heroes of a moral struggle. And
I like this, and I want to just point out, this is one of the reasons why you should ask for terms to be clearly agreed upon when you're having a conversation. Like, what do you mean by hate? What do you mean by XYZ, ABC? I think that's a great point. Let's go.
Anyone who disagrees is the enemy. When one side believes it's in the right, simply because it's monopolized a set of nice-sounding floating signifiers, its followers can easily slip into thinking they're objectively right, and that anyone who disagrees is objectively wrong. Take a moment to consider this contradiction. Robinson accused Kirk of spreading hate, while he himself went on to commit the most hateful act imaginable. That's the power of floating signifiers. They don't just label, they elevate one group as morally superior and cast the other as inherently dangerous. Take Matthew Dowd, a political consultant, who had this to say about Charlie Kirk after the incident.
He's been one of the most divisive, especially divisive younger figures in this, who is constantly sort of pushing this sort of hate speech or sort of aimed at certain groups. I always go back to hateful thoughts lead to hateful words, which then lead to hateful actions. And I think that's the environment we're in, that people just, you can't stop with these sort of awful thoughts you have and then saying these awful words and not expect awful actions to take place.
Matthew Dowd is a political analyst. When he repeatedly uses floating signifiers like hate and divisive and subjective terms like awful, it's not accidental. He knows exactly what he's doing. Everything from his repetition to his emphasis on words like constantly reveals how calculated his framing is. It's not just rhetoric, it's tactic. so deliberate in fact that it reveals a specific rhetorical device, diacope, the repetition of a word or phrase, often used for emotional emphasis.
Hateful thoughts, hateful words, hateful actions. Awful thoughts, awful words, awful actions.
Dowd's use of floating signifiers and emotional cues isn't designed to inform. It's designed to persuade by bypassing logic. These are appeals to pathos, not logos. He never defines what hate speech actually means. He never explains what makes something awful, because those terms are subjective by design. They allow him to frame the narrative without having to defend the substance. That's the disingenuous move. Label someone with a term like hate, and suddenly you've won the argument without.
I also want to point out that when I hear the word hate and when you hear the word hate, those could be two different things. I mean, two different understandings based upon where you're from, where you're hearing this, how old you are, how young you are, there's so many different factors that will play into the word hate. I think he is right on the money by saying that, hey, by putting this out, what do you call it, floating signifier, putting that out there, is also going to be translated differently by each person if there's not a clear definition.
Ever having to make one. And here's the contradiction. He accuses others of being divisive while using some of the most divisive rhetoric possible. But that's the point. The rhetoric of politicians and political commentators like Dowd often depends on division. Without an enemy, they can't cast themselves as the voice of unity or salvation. They need us versus them discourses to appear like uniters or saviors. That's the core contradiction, one that deceptive people not only ignore, but rely on, even cherish. Journalists don't bother with definitions of hate speech either, even though they claim to enlighten and clarify. Take James Clayton, a BBC journalist, for instance.
Particularly around hate speech in the company. Is that
what hate speech are you talking about? I mean, you use Twitter.
Right.
Do you see a rise in hate speech?
Personally, for you, I would see I get more of that kind of content. Yeah, personally.
To describe a hateful thing.
Yeah, I mean, just content that will solicit a reaction, something that may include something that is slightly racist or slightly sexist, those kinds of things.
So
those kinds of things. He hasn't even defined anything. Instead, he uses two other floating signifiers to prove the floating signifier hate.
Slightly racist or slightly sexist.
But that's not how you prove anything. So content that'll solicit a reaction is hateful. Let me guess, that vague, logically inconsistent definition only applies to content he dislikes. Clayton doesn't seem confident in his own reasoning, probably because there isn't much of it. He tries to project ease as if he's stating the obvious. But everything from his gaze to his restarts to his hollow definitions suggests otherwise.
That's why I'm asking for examples. Can you name one example?
I honestly don't use.
You can't name a single example.
I'll tell you why, because I don't actually use that for you feed anymore, because I just don't particularly like it.
The adverb, honestly, is the first warning sign that Clayton knows he's not being honest. Why invoke honesty in a context where honesty is assumed? And no, he's not being honest, because he just finished using the For You feed as grounds to his claim that he's starting to see more hateful content.
My For You.
But now he claims he doesn't use the feed.
I don't actually use that For You.
To escape this contradiction, he casually inserts the adverb just, a classic move to oversimplify and downplay.
I just don't particularly like it.
But no rhetorical softener can change the fact that he fails to substantiate his claim. I'll let Musk finish my argument.
No,
I don't think this is getting anywhere.
You literally said you experienced more hateful content and then couldn't name a single example.
Right, and as I said,
that's absurd.
I bring up this example because journalists like Clayton have enormous influence over what people believe about the world, about certain groups, about political issues. It's rare to see one of them challenged the way Musk challenges him here. Had this been an article or a polished news segment, Clayton's oversimplified and unexamined talking points would have gone entirely unchallenged, which means audiences, especially younger, more impressionable ones, would absorb floating signifiers like hate speech or
slightly sexist
without ever examining the specific context in which they're being used. When challenged, many influential figures resort to the same tactic Clayton tries: deflection. They frame their opponent as nitpicking or harping on irrelevant details for self-serving reasons, anything to shut down the conversation as quickly as possible. But notice how eager they are to deliver their deliberately vague generalizations in speeches and monologues where no one can push back. That alone speaks volumes about a worldview that can't withstand scrutiny.
Whatever your gender, your preferred pronouns blossom to be, we all know it ain't so black and white.
We want to end gender inequality. I was confused being called bossy because I wanted to direct the plays that we would put on for our parents, but the boys were not. It is time that we all perceive gender on a spectrum.
Everybody who has been brave enough to be honest about how they feel, to live their lives as they are, as they feel they should be, as they identify.
You've done so much to advance the cause of equality and freedom, equal justice under law. It is not to be debated.
Equality and justice for all, period.
LGBT rights are under attack by a Justice Department that now stands on the side of discrimination instead of equality.
Instead of caring about specifics, people have grown accustomed to oversimplifying floating signifiers. And instead of engaging with their opponent's arguments, they've learned to label them. And labeling opens the door to dehumanization, as if the person being labeled is somehow undeserving of the same loving, open-minded, and inclusive treatment reserved for so-called allies. Of course, terms like loving, inclusive, and open-minded mean the opposite. They're used to justify excluding those who disagree. And allies, that word frames every disagreement as part of an us and them struggle. Floating signifiers and emotionally calculated slogans thrive where arguments and logic are absent. We see it everywhere, in schools, in the media, in politics, and throughout celebrity and influencer culture. Let's look at a few more examples of floating signifiers and calculated emotional appeals, particularly in politics and celebrity culture, where they've become a substitute for actual arguments.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the JWhit Podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please do me a favor and hit me up with that 3-piece special. Like the video, subscribe, and of course, share it with somebody who would also enjoy this type of content. And make sure you leave a comment because I do pin the best comments to the top. So thank you so much for tuning in today. And until next time, everybody, grace and peace.